A hush falls over Dublin as wedding bells refuse to ring. Aisling O'Devlin, clad in dove-grey satin, walks alone from a chapel doorway, jilted by a marquess and judged by a city. Yet beneath the rain and whispers, something stirs. A secret bequest that will upend fortunes, a past that refuses to stay buried, and an impossible choice between duty and desire. Pride will be tested. Power will change hands, and a single melody will demand the courage to forgive or to burn it all down. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about period romances? The scandal, the slow burn longing, or the triumph after heartbreak? Dublin, Ireland, the spring of 1856. The morning rose pale and uncertain, a veil of mist settling over the river Liffey like breath upon glass. The bells of St. Stephen's tolled their patient summons across the damp air, echoing through streets still slick from the night's drizzle. Within the hush of the hour, a solitary carriage turned the corner, its wheels murmuring against the cobblestones, carrying a young woman whose heart had not yet learned to believe in misfortune. Aisling O'Devlin sat within, her gloved hands folded over a bouquet of white heather and myrtle, flowers chosen not for grandeur, but for faithfulness. Her gown of dove-grey satin shimmered softly under the dull morning light, the colour chosen to honour modesty rather than wealth. The delicate lace at her cuffs trembled slightly each time the carriage jolted, betraying the nervous rhythm of her pulse. She had sewn the lace herself by candlelight, never imagining the irony that would soon thread through every stitch. The driver slowed as they reached the small stone chapel at the end of Merrion Street. Through the fogged window, she could see the doorway garlanded with ivy, and two boys from the parish arranging fresh lilies on the steps. She smiled faintly, an act of courage rather than happiness, and pressed a hand to her chest. Somewhere inside her, music hummed, the echo of a piano sonata she had composed in secret. Its melody, hopeful and trembling, was the only language she truly trusted. When she stepped down, the chill wind caught her veil and carried it sideways, wrapping it around her arm like a reluctant companion. She entered the chapel alone. The pews were half filled, students she had once taught, a few sympathetic ladies who adored her playing, and even two tenants from the Glenfullen estate who had made the long journey north to see their lord wed. The murmurs fell quiet as she walked down the aisle. The vicar glanced toward the heavy wooden door, his expression uncertain. Minutes became a half hour. The air grew dense, the lilies beginning to wilt under the heat of the waiting lamps. Whispers spread like rain, finding every crevice. Someone claimed the Marquess's carriage had been delayed. Another murmured he had taken ill. A young maid approached with trembling hands and offered Aisling a sip of water, her pity unguarded. Still, Aisling waited. Her heart beat steadily, stubbornly, as though each throb could call him back from whatever shadow had claimed him. Declan Rathmore, her beloved, her promise, her future. She had seen kindness in his eyes once, had believed that a noble title could coexist with a noble soul. She had been wrong before in life, but never about him, until now. When the door finally opened, it was not Declan who entered, but a breathless footman bearing a folded note sealed with the Glenfullen crest. The vicar hesitated, then handed it to her with grave eyes. The parchment trembled in her fingers as she broke the seal. It was short, barely a dozen words. "Forgive me, I cannot come. Circumstance demands I obey duty, not desire." The letters blurred as tears welled in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. The silence in the chapel grew unbearable. Someone coughed. Another whispered, "Poor girl." Aisling stood very straight, lifted her chin, and folded the note neatly before placing it into the pocket of her gown. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm enough to still the air. "There will be no ceremony today." She turned, her skirts whispering against the stone floor, and walked back down the aisle past rows of lowered eyes. Outside, the fog had thickened into a fine rain. She did not summon the carriage. Instead, she gathered her skirts in one hand and walked, her heeled boots striking the pavement in quiet defiance. By the time she reached her modest boarding house near Camden Street, the rain had soaked the hem of her gown and loosened the pins from her hair. Miss Nolan met her at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes wide with dread. "Child," she breathed, pulling her inside. "Oh, my poor child." Aisling said nothing. She stood in the small parlour where the scent of baking bread mingled with coal dust and old polish. Her reflection in the darkened mirror startled her, her cheeks flushed with cold, her veil clinging damply to her neck, her eyes hollow yet unbroken. Miss Nolan fussed over her, bringing a blanket and tea, muttering fierce words about men born without souls. But Aisling only reached for the small fire burning low in the grate. From her pocket she drew the folded note, smoothed it with deliberate care, and then held it over the flame. The paper curled slowly, the ink blackening into smoke. She dropped it into the hearth and watched it vanish. The room flickered with the orange glow of its passing. "I was foolish," she whispered at last. "I thought love could rise above station, that sincerity might count for more than coin." Miss Nolan pressed a hand to her shoulder. "It still may, darling, just not today." Aisling shook her head faintly. "No, not ever again." Her voice carried no bitterness, only the solemnity of a vow. When Miss Nolan left her to rest, Aisling remained by the fire, her gloved hands laid flat on her lap. She stared at the dancing embers, remembering Declan's laughter, his letters, his promises of a life filled with music and sunlight. Perhaps he had meant them once, but words spoken by men of privilege often wilted like hothouse flowers, beautiful in warmth, lifeless in weather. Outside, the rain beat harder against the window panes, 1,000 soft drums echoing her thoughts. She rose, removed her gloves, and placed them upon the hearth. The satin caught quickly, the edges glowing red before collapsing into grey ash. Aisling stood straight and still, her face illuminated by the last flicker of flame. Somewhere far across the city, the carriages of the rich rattled toward candle-lit dinners, and the Marquis who had once promised her forever drank a toast to his own cowardice. But in that narrow room, with only the rain for company, Aisling O'Devlin made a quiet, indelible promise, not to the man who had broken her, but to the woman she would now become. Never again would she bend her life to the will of another. Never again would she let a title decide her worth. As the fire died down, she drew her shawl around her shoulders and sat by the window, gazing at the blurred city beyond the glass. Dublin lay half-hidden in mist, the gas lamps flickering like uncertain stars. She could almost hear the echo of her own piano from a distant parlour, the music of a woman who had been abandoned, but not defeated. And as dawn crept through the clouds, soft and colourless, she whispered into the grey morning, "The lesson is learned." The days following the failed wedding were not marked by weeping, nor by bitter letters, nor by a retreat into shadow. Aisling O'Devlin did not fall apart. She did not vanish from the lanes of Dublin like other women ruined by scandal. Instead, she rose each morning with her hair neatly pinned, her face serene, her music lessons uninterrupted. Though her steps were quiet, they carried a weight they had never borne before. The weight of betrayal, yes, but also of awakening. On the 7th day, just as the bells of St. Patrick's tolled 1 o'clock beneath a drizzle of light rain, a knock sounded at Miss Nolan's boarding-house door. It was not the persistent rap of a creditor, nor the clumsy thump of a delivery boy. It was a crisp, deliberate summons. Aisling, seated at the parlour window copying notes for a student's composition, turned toward the sound with vague curiosity. Miss Nolan opened the door to reveal a man dressed in a woolen black coat, a bowler hat, and spectacles that glinted with raindrops. He held a leather satchel and bore the look of someone who measured time, not by clocks, but by contracts. "Miss Aisling O'Devlin?" he asked, removing his hat with respect. "I am she," Aisling replied, standing slowly, instinctively smoothing her skirts. I am Mr. Lionel Wexley, solicitor of the firm Hanrahan and Ward. May I have a moment of your time? The matter is both delicate and urgent." She led him to the fireside, offering tea with the grace that remained her inheritance, even when she had possessed little else. He declined with a shake of the head and opened his satchel, drawing forth a sealed packet and a sheaf of legal documents. "I regret to inform you," he began, "that Mr. Horatio Bellamy of New York has passed." Isling's brow furrowed. "Mr. Bellamy? He was once your student, I believe, aboard the Rosalind when he was stationed briefly in Dublin, nearly 2 decades ago." Aisling blinked. A boy with large hands and a shy smile rose from her memory, one who had stumbled over Bach and adored Chopin, whose family had left Ireland during the famine and made a fortune laying rail across America. "Yes," she whispered. "He was 11, and he cried when I left." Mr. Wexley inclined his head. "He never forgot you, Miss O'Devlin, not in 30 years. She pressed her fingers against her lips as the solicitor continued, unfolding the will. Horatio Bellamy had no wife, no children, no living siblings. He had amassed great wealth, railroads, shipping contracts, property shares across 2 continents. And to Aisling, the woman who had once taught him the value of music and discipline in a time of grief, he left the majority of his estate. It was not merely a bequest of sentiment, it was empire. Her first reaction was disbelief, her second a long silence, her third a trembling laugh, soft and hollow. "I never asked anything of him," she murmured. "And he knew that," said Mr. Wexley, offering her the final page. "He requests only that you use what you need and that you give the rest with your own hands." The documents detailed real estate in Dublin, investments in mills, and, curiously, a controlling stake in the Glenfallen Canal Company. Aisling's eyes froze on the name. "Glenfallen?" she repeated, her voice low, but not uncertain. "Yes, miss. Purchased quietly through intermediaries last year. Mr. Bellamy wished to return something to the soil that had once fed him." His words. The irony burned slow and sharp in her chest. Declan Rathmore had left her at the altar because she was too poor, too humble, too insignificant to carry the title of Marchioness, and now, without raising a single hand, she held the keys to the estate that kept his family name afloat. She did not speak again for some time. Mr. Wexley left with a promise to return once the formal signatures were ready. Miss Nolan stood in the hallway with a tea towel in her hands, mouth slightly agape. "Well then," she whispered, her voice both reverent and stunned. "The good Lord has a taste for irony, doesn't he?" But Aisling did not smile. She walked slowly to her small, upright piano in the parlour, pressed her fingers to the ivory, and played a single note, soft, low, and aching. It lingered in the air like an unanswered question. Within the month, Aisling moved to a tall Georgian townhouse on Upper Mount Street, overlooking the green fringe of Merrion Square. The house had once belonged to a banker and bore the marks of sober elegance: marble hearths, dark mahogany staircases, tall windows veiled in lace. She furnished it not with extravagance, but with care. A pianoforte in the drawing room, a well-stocked library on the 2nd floor, and a small schoolroom for orphaned girls in the garden annex. Her wardrobe changed only by necessity. She wore soft silks now, yes, but always in storm grey, indigo or moss green, with little lace at the collar and no diamonds at her ears. Her bonnets were tasteful, her gloves finely stitched, and her presence unignorable. Society took notice. The same ladies who had turned their backs at the chapel now called upon her with baskets of flowers and guarded curiosity. They whispered that she was mysterious, that she had come into fortune by divine providence, that she was a woman of uncommon grace. Some wondered aloud why she did not host dances or attend the opera more often. Others suspected a scandal too artfully concealed to unravel. Aisling, for her part, remained composed. She welcomed music students into her home. She met with school trustees and discussed wages for teachers. She wrote anonymous donations to soup kitchens, ensured the Glenfallen tolls remained frozen, and signed every check with a calm, looping hand. And yet, late at night, when the fire in her room burned low and the city fell silent, she would find herself at the tall parlour window, gazing toward the south, toward Glenfallen. Her fingers would rest on the velvet curtain as if it were a piano key. Her thoughts would drift toward Declan, not with longing, but with a question that had no answer. What will you do now, my lord, when the power you once wielded rests in the hands of the woman you cast aside? Far from her townhouse, across fields and fog, Glenfallen House stood half empty and cold. The pipes rattled, the roof leaked in the west wing, and the tenants had begun to grumble aloud. The canal brought less profit by the month, and Lord Rathmore muttered about liquidation. And Declan, who had once believed that time and silence could wash away cowardice, received a letter from the new majority shareholder of the canal. It bore no signature, only the embossed mark of Bellamy's estate, and a line of music notated in a minor, unmistakable to anyone who had once stood beside a piano and watched Aisling O'Devlin's hands bring melody to life. Declan sat back in his chair, the paper trembling in his hand, and for the first time in many months he felt not guilt, but the stirrings of dread. Because Aisling had not disappeared, she had risen, and now she held his world in the palm of her hand. The carriages lined Fitzwilliam Square like a parade of polished obsidian beasts, their brass lanterns flickering beneath the gaslights, their velvet interiors hiding secrets stitched behind brocade. A soft drizzle fell over Dublin that evening, the kind that clung like lace to sleeves and whispered against the brim of a gentleman's hat. Inside the Carrington mansion, however, the air shimmered with candlelight and expectation. The grand charity ball in honour of the Society for Irish Widows had drawn every name worth a column in the social papers. Music from a 20-piece orchestra drifted beneath crystal chandeliers, and the scent of gardenia and brandied plum filled the marbled hall. Men in deep green and navy waistcoats bowed to women crowned in pearls, their laughter rehearsed, their movements timed like clock hands in a waltz of appearances. And then the room paused. She had not arrived with fanfare. There were no trumpets to announce her, no diamonds to herald her fortune. And yet, when Aisling O'Devlin stepped through the arched doorway of the ballroom, silence trailed her like a silk train. She wore a gown of storm-grey silk, its bodice tailored to quiet perfection, its sleeves fitted to her wrists with delicate buttons of jet. The skirt fell in austere waves, crinolineless, a deliberate choice that moved against the excess of the evening. At her throat, a single pearl hung from a thin black ribbon. Her auburn hair had been swept into a regal twist, with not a single strand out of place, yet the softness of her features, her high cheekbones, the gentle arch of her brow, the serenity of her hazel-green eyes, rendered her more luminous than any lady draped in diamonds. There was no need to announce her name. Everyone knew it. Lady Carrington, a well-practiced manipulator of attention, greeted her with effusive warmth before leading her toward the receiving line. Whispers moved like a tide. "She looks like a duchess. That's the woman who was jilted. She owns the canal now, you know." Aisling, unbothered, accepted greetings with quiet poise. Her fingers, gloved in grey lace, moved with musical precision as she took the offered hands of strangers who had once refused to meet her eyes. She did not linger. She did not explain. She was not here to be pitied nor adored. She had come for a reason. Across the ballroom, Declan Rathmore stood near a cluster of wax-polished columns, his back straight, one hand curled around a crystal glass of brandy. His frock coat was black, his waistcoat burgundy, his cravat tied with precise indifference. He had seen her enter, and for a full minute he had not breathed. She had changed, yes, but more than in appearance. There was a stillness to her now, a deliberate control in her movements, in the slight turn of her head, the economy of her smile. And yet the woman before him was unmistakably the same Aisling who once played Brahms in a room no wider than a hallway, her face alight with the quiet rapture of music. She turned. Their eyes met across the distance, a single glance. No one else in the room noticed the collision of that moment, but for Declan, it struck like thunder muffled under brocade. He set his glass down. Lady Carrington, ever the architect of dramatic entrances and dangerous unions, drifted toward Aisling once more and murmured in her ear with a theatrical smile, "Lord Glenfallen is present this evening. Shall I arrange a dance?" Aisling's reply was a tilt of the head, a smile so faint it could have been imagined. "Only if he asks." He did. A half-hour later, after one waltz, 2 quadrilles, and a dozen glances that never quite reached her, Declan finally crossed the floor with the solemnity of a man approaching confession. "Miss O'Devlin," he said with a bow, his voice even, though his pulse strained against his collar, "may I have the honor?" She placed her hand in his, her touch light and cool. "Of course, my lord." The music swelled. A slow, elegant waltz with subtle melancholia woven between its chords. They moved together in silence for several bars, her posture composed, his grip careful, as if afraid the slightest misstep would shatter what little remained between them. "I did not expect to see you here tonight," he said quietly. She lifted her eyes. "Then you do not know me as well as you once thought." He glanced down briefly. "No," he admitted. "I suppose I don't." They turned in time with the music, the ballroom blurring into candlelight and silk and shadow. His hand at her waist never tightened, but the tension beneath his glove was unmistakable. The scent of her skin, lavender and clean linen, nearly undid him. "You seem well," he murmured. "I am," she said softly, then paused. "Prosperity has an odd way of clarifying what is worth mourning." He flinched, not visibly but inwardly. "Aisling, I have no interest in revisiting that day," she said gently, not unkindly. "What's done is done." The music slowed. Their steps shifted closer. "But I do have business to discuss, my lord." "Business?" His voice barely held its surprise. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "You have tenants on the Glenfallen land who face eviction within the month. The canal tolls are too high. The winter was harsh. I've reviewed the ledgers." He hesitated. "There are pressures I must consider." "There always are," she replied. "When comfort is threatened, I've drafted a proposal. A 3-month toll reduction in exchange for immediate relief to the tenants, fuel, seed, and a suspension of rent for those unable to pay." He blinked. "You're making this offer here? Now?" Aisling's lips curved slightly. It seemed more tasteful than doing so by letter. He studied her, and for a moment the ballroom ceased to exist. There was only her voice, calm and unflinching, and the knowledge that she had risen higher than any man in the room could have anticipated. "I will consider it," he said at last. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You will accept it. Or you will explain to your tenants why you would rather protect pride than people." The music ended. They stood still for a moment too long. Applause rippled through the room. He stepped back, bowed. She curtsied with cool elegance. "Good evening, Lord Glenfallen," she said. "Miss O'Devlin," he murmured. She turned and walked away, her grey skirts moving like the tide beneath the chandeliers. From the far corner of the ballroom, Lord Rathmore watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. The old man's lips twisted around the stem of his walking stick, and he leaned toward a man half hidden by velvet drapery. "She's bolder than I thought," he muttered. "That will have to change." The shadow beside him, broad-shouldered, with ink-stained gloves, nodded. And with a gesture as quiet as it was damning, Lord Rathmore gave the order that would begin the unravelling. But across the ballroom, Aisling O'Devlin reached for a glass of water with the serenity of a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the rooftops of Dublin when Aisling O'Devlin sat down at her writing desk, the sleeves of her dove-grey morning gown rolled to her elbows and a faint smudge of ink on her left thumb. The day outside was silver and still, the kind that made everything seem suspended in time. But inside her townhouse, the air was thick with tension. Laid out before her were columns of figures, handwritten receipts, and recent expenditure reports from the Glenfallen Canal Company. She had reviewed them twice already, but something didn't sit right. The numbers whispered in different tones, as if each page had been written by a separate hand, each intent on concealing the truth behind tidy sums. Miss Nolan entered with a tray of tea and a plate of oat biscuits. "You've not touched breakfast," she said, her voice thick with concern. "You'll go blind squinting at that mess." Aisling didn't lift her eyes. "Tell me, Nolan, what does it mean when a repair to a canal lock is billed 5 times in a quarter, but the lock in question hasn't been touched in over a year?" Miss Nolan blinked. "It means someone's lining their pockets with gold." Aisling nodded. "Exactly what I feared." The Glenfallen Canal Company had once been a modest but honourable venture. But under the shadow of Lord Rathmore's oversight, it had transformed into something quieter and colder, an apparatus of wealth for the few, built on the backs of tenants and labourers who received little more than broken promises and rising tolls. Her control of the company gave her power, but it also made her a target, especially if her suspicions proved true. She needed eyes within, and that meant Seamus Kearney. He was a boy of 20, clever, earnest, and still too green to have learned the art of corruption. Aisling had noticed him once at a shareholder meeting, scribbling notes with fierce concentration while older clerks lounged like indifferent cats. His collar had been askew, his cuffs slightly frayed, but his mind, she had sensed, was sharp. She summoned him to the house that very afternoon. When Seamus arrived, he looked nervous beneath his threadbare wool coat, but his spine was straight, and he met her gaze without trembling. Aisling offered him tea, then set the documents before him. "I need your help," she said plainly. "I believe the numbers have been tampered with." Seamus adjusted his spectacles. "Tampered, miss? Falsified, rewritten, hidden." Her voice did not waver. "And I need someone with nothing to gain and everything to prove." His ears flushed pink. I'm not trained in investigative accounting." "No," she said, "but you're the only one I trust to look without blinking." So began their quiet alliance. For days, Seamus arrived after hours and worked beside Aisling by candlelight. He combed through ledgers, compared signatures, traced invoices to non-existent firms. His fingers turned black with ink, his eyes ringed with fatigue. But slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. There were overcharges for stone shipments that never arrived, payments to shell companies, and names Aisling recognized as cronies of Lord Rathmore, men who had stood beside him at dinners and whispered behind their gloved hands at the charity ball. "Here," Seamus said one evening, tapping a figure circled in pencil. "This amount was paid twice. Same date, same description." Aisling leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "And the address?" "Fake," he whispered. "The company doesn't exist." A silence settled between them, broken only by the soft hiss of the hearth. "I knew it," she breathed. "But I needed proof." Seamus hesitated. "You'll report it?" "Yes," she said, but her gaze drifted toward the window. "And I will not do so quietly." Meanwhile, far from the gaslit streets of Dublin, the Glenfallen estate was wrapped in a colder kind of silence. The land stretched grey and damp beneath a low slate sky. Trees stripped bare clawed at the air, and the soil lay hard beneath the hooves of Declan's horse. He had not ridden through these parts in years, not since before the famine, and the chill that wrapped around his shoulders was not entirely due to the weather. He had taken her offer. The tolls had been reduced, relief had been dispatched, but the weight of Glenfallen's decay sat heavy on his conscience, a rot that had grown under the watch of men who shared his name. He dismounted before a crumbling cottage with a crooked chimney and a door that hung on one hinge. Smoke did not rise from the hearth. No livestock moved in the yard. He knocked once. No answer. He stepped inside and paused. The room smelled of damp linen and old sickness. A child lay on a straw pallet near the hearth, her cheeks flushed with fever, her breath shallow. She looked no older than 6. A thin blanket covered her to the chin, but her fingers were purple with cold. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and for a moment she smiled. "Papa," she rasped. Declan sank to one knee beside her. "No, little one, I'm not your papa, but I'm going to help you." He looked around. There was no one. No firewood, no medicine, only a broken spoon beside a bowl of rainwater. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms. Her body was light, frighteningly so, as if the fever had burned through all that sustained her. He wrapped her in his riding cloak and stepped back into the wind, mounting his horse with difficulty. He rode hard toward the parish house 2 miles north, shouting before he reached the gate. The priest's housekeeper, a broad woman with kind eyes, took the child without question. "She's Bridget," she said. "Her mother went to sell lace in town 3 days ago and never came back." Declan stood beside the hearth as they warmed the child's body with blankets and steam. His gloves were soaked, his boots caked with mud, but he did not move until Bridget stirred, her lashes fluttering against her cheek. "She'll live," the woman said softly. Declan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. An hour later, when he stepped back outside, the wind hit him like judgment. He had not seen what his land had become. He had ridden past these cottages too many times, eyes fixed on the hedgerows, not the faces within. Now, as the door closed behind him, the words Aisling had spoken weeks before echoed like a bell. "You will explain to your tenants why you would rather protect pride than people." That night, Declan wrote to the estate steward and ordered the suspension of all evictions. He released grain stores, he allocated funds to the local schoolhouse, and in the margin of his letter he wrote a single line: "Send someone to look for Bridget's mother. Offer her work in the kitchens." Back in Dublin, Aisling stood on her balcony, the winter wind lifting the hem of her shawl. Seamus had just left with a sealed copy of their findings. She looked out over the rooftops, heart heavy with resolve. Justice, she knew, would never be given freely. But she would not stop until it was taken back, inch by inch, ledger by ledger, life by life. The wind arrived first, cutting, bitter and sharp as a whispered lie. It swept through the streets of Dublin with the restless fury of something unseen, turning gas lamps into trembling halos and curling parchment posters from the sides of brick buildings. By mid-morning, the city was abuzz. Newsboys shouted in corners, their fingers red from cold ink and scandal. "Read the truth behind the canal heiress. Is Miss O'Devlin a saint or a serpent?" Music, money and revenge. The pamphlet was printed on cheap grey paper, but it bore the weight of a dagger. Bold lettering crowned the front. "A ballad for betrayal. How the music mistress now plays with men's fortunes." It was unsigned. No publisher, no author, just words. Cruel, insinuating, devastating words. Aisling O'Devlin read it in silence. Miss Nolan had tried to intercept it before it reached her. She had even scolded the boy who brought it, threatening to send him flying with a broom. But the damage was done. Aisling sat in the front parlour, sunlight slicing across the carpet in perfect angles, holding the thin paper between her gloved hands. The accusations were as vile as they were calculated. They said she had seduced a grieving American for his wealth, then used that fortune to exact vengeance on the man who left her at the altar. They claimed she manipulated the Glenfallen tolls not for fairness, but to punish Declan Rathmore's name. They called her cold, ambitious and dangerous beneath her modest gowns and quiet charities, but worst of all, woven between insinuations and venom, was a line of music. A bar from a composition she had never played publicly. A haunting phrase written in a minor, the heart of a nocturne she had once titled Unspoken. A piece she had only shared with one soul, Declan. She lowered the pamphlet slowly and stared at the fire. Miss Nolan, watching from the doorway, cleared her throat nervously. "It's filth, every word. People'll forget it by Tuesday." "No," Aisling said softly. "They won't." The melody looped in her mind like a thread pulled too tightly. The sheet music had been tucked in a drawer, folded in privacy, protected from careless eyes. She remembered the night she showed it to him, the study at Glenfallen, a storm outside, the warmth of his gaze as he traced the notes with reverence. She had believed he understood her in that moment more than anyone ever had. Now that trust lay shattered like glass beneath her heel, she rose, "Send for Seamus." By the time the young clerk arrived, dusk had settled over the city, and the drawing room was lit only by lamplight. Seamus stepped inside, his coat still dusted with soot, spectacles slightly askew. "I saw it," he said grimly. "Everyone has. Do you know who printed it?" He nodded. "It came from a hand press used by the Citizens' Clarion. They publish radical pieces, mostly anonymous. Political attacks, gossip, smears. They don't list names, but they list debts." Aisling folded her arms. "Who paid for the ink?" "I followed the paper trail," Seamus said, pulling a small ledger from his satchel. "The payment came through a third party, a man named Graham Murtaugh, former servant at Glenfallen, dismissed 3 months ago." Her breath caught. "I remember him," she whispered. "He once polished the keys of the pianoforte. I trusted him in that room." Seamus looked up. He was deep in debt. His brother gambled away their savings. I suspect Lord Rathmore offered him coin in exchange for information, perhaps the sheet music. Something intimate, something damning. Aisling's throat tightened. "And Declan?" Seamus hesitated. "No trace. His name isn't linked to any of it. And I believe him innocent." She closed her eyes for a moment. The pain was not just betrayal. It was the erosion of memory. That music had not merely been a melody. It had been her heart, transcribed in half notes and rests. To see it reduced to a weapon felt like being stripped naked before a jeering crowd. But she would not be undone. The next morning, before she could compose a response, another storm arrived, this one legal, a summons. Lord Rathmore had filed a petition in the Chancery Court, arguing that Miss Aisling O'Devlin, being a woman recently abandoned in public disgrace and now embroiled in printed scandal, was mentally unfit to serve on the Glenfallen Canal Company board, as her conduct was governed by emotion rather than sound judgment. The language was precise, poisonous, and designed to humiliate. Aisling read the petition aloud in her study while Seamus stood beside her, fists clenched. "Emotional instability," she said with a bitter smile. "A charge as old as Eve." Seamus paced. "It's a trap. If you respond angrily, they'll claim hysteria. If you ignore it, they'll claim guilt." Aisling folded the paper slowly, smoothing the edges as if preparing a sonata. "Then we respond with evidence." She handed Seamus a separate document, a summary of the falsified ledgers, complete with annotations, copies, and official records. "Deliver this to the magistrate, quietly, before they try to bury the truth." Seamus nodded, already moving. "And Seamus?" she added, her voice steady. He turned. "Thank you for staying." His eyes softened behind the round glass of his spectacles. "You gave me a place to matter, Miss O'Devlin. I'll protect it with my life." That night, alone in the drawing room, Aisling sat at the pianoforte. She did not play unspoken. That piece was no longer hers. It had been stolen, twisted, made grotesque. But music still lived within her, even now, especially now. She placed her hands on the keys and began a new composition, one built not on longing, but on defiance. The notes rose like steel through the air, not delicate, but deliberate. It had no title yet, but its shape was already forming. Across the city, Declan stood before the fire in his study, reading the pamphlet for the third time. The bar of music stared back at him like a ghost. "I never gave it away," he muttered aloud. "I swear it." Lord Rathmore entered unannounced, his cane tapping against the floor like a metronome of disdain. "You're unusually quiet," he said. Declan turned, fury barely contained. "Did you send Murtaugh to dig through her things? Did you use a melody, a private sacred thing, as a political knife?" His uncle raised a brow. "You overestimate the sanctity of women's emotions, nephew. They must be kept in check. She's not one of us." Declan stepped forward. "She's more than any of us." Lord Rathmore smirked. "Be careful. Defend her publicly and you'll fall with her. The court will ruin her. Let it happen. Let the board return to order." Declan stared into the fire, jaw tight, hands clenched. He had made one coward's choice in his life. He would not make another. At the townhouse on Upper Mount Street, the final note of Aisling's new composition lingered in the air like a vow. She was no longer the girl abandoned at the altar, no longer the music mistress mocked behind fans. She was something else now, something they had not prepared for. And if they thought they could strip her of power with ink and slander, they had yet to learn how a woman reclaims her name, with silence, with strength, with song. The fire began at dusk. The sun had not yet disappeared beyond the western hills, but the light had shifted to that dusky copper tone that marked the close of day, when the world seemed to hold its breath. Glenfallen, quiet in its solitude, stirred with the sudden vicious glow that bled from behind the stables like a wound spreading across the sky. By the time the alarm bell was rung, the barn was fully engulfed. Flames danced through the wooden beams like devils in prayer, consuming the roof in a matter of moments. Smoke bloomed black and thick, rolling across the fields with a hunger that devoured fences, hay bales, and hope. Men and boys ran with buckets, shouted for water, beat at the flames with coats and blankets, but the fire roared louder than their efforts. One of the stable boys, young Padraig, just turned 10, had been fetching straw when the blaze erupted. By the time they pulled him out, he was coughing blood and crying for his mother. Declan Rathmore arrived breathless, his horse lathered in sweat, boots splattered in mud. He jumped down before the beast had fully stopped and ran toward the chaos, barking orders, stripping off his coat, dragging water with bare hands. The heat was merciless. He burned his palms helping carry the child, scorched the edge of his waistcoat while saving the last mare from the blaze. When it was done, when the barn had collapsed inward like a dying creature and the fire hissed into black ash, he stood in the field, soot on his face, smoke in his lungs, a blister forming just beneath his collar. The fire inspector arrived 2 hours later. His face was grim, his fingers stained with oil and ash. "There's evidence of lamp oil poured near the back wall," he said, in a pattern that suggests purpose, sabotage. Declan's voice was hoarse. "Could it have been an accident?" The man shook his head. "Too neat, too quick, too deliberate." Declan's stomach twisted. Behind him, tenants gathered in clusters, wives holding children close, farmers staring at what had once been their shared lifeline. A few looked at him with eyes full of unease. Whispers were already crawling through the estate like insects in the dark. The fire was meant to ruin the harvest, to scare them off the land. "Rathmore wants to sell it. He needs a reason to force us out." Declan knew too well that fear was fertile soil for rumour. And his uncle, who had long viewed the land as little more than ledger lines, would not hesitate to use fear as leverage. But Declan would not allow it. He sent a rider into the city that night with one name, Aisling O'Devlin. She arrived the next morning, cloaked in heavy wool, the colour of smoke, her expression unreadable as she stepped from her carriage into the chilled morning air. The tenants turned to watch her, some with awe, others with caution, but when she approached the smouldering ruin, it was with neither pride nor pity. She went first to Padraig's mother, kneeling in the dirt to take her hands. "He'll survive," the woman whispered, "but he coughs so deep." "We'll have a physician sent from the capital," Aisling said gently. "He'll have the best treatment. You have my word." Then she turned to the rest. Fathers and grandmothers, young boys with ash in their hair, girls with soot on their cheeks, and spoke clearly. "This land will not be sold," she said. "I will not allow it. You will not be evicted, not by fire, not by force." The air shifted. Fear gave way, if not to peace, then to something like steadiness. The way a melody stills the breath just before it resolves. Declan stood a few paces behind her, his chest tight with something he could not name. He had not expected her to come, but she had. They did not speak until the sun began its descent, and the tenants returned to their cottages. Declan gestured toward his waiting carriage. "Let me take you back to town," he said. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. They rode in silence at first, the wheels rattling over uneven country roads, the sky above bruised with coming rain. Inside the carriage, lamplight flickered softly, catching the fine curve of her jaw, the tension in her gloved hands. When the first drops struck the glass, she finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell them yourself?" she asked, voice quiet. "That the land would not be sold, that they were safe." He exhaled. "Because I'm not sure they would have believed me. Not anymore." She turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Then why not speak anyway? Why let the silence do more harm?" He met her gaze, and there was no defense left in him. "Because I've been silent before," he said, "and it cost too much." Rain pelted harder now, streaking the windows, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. Aisling looked away, her expression unreadable. He leaned forward slightly. "I didn't send that pamphlet. I didn't give them your music." "I know," she said. His eyes widened. "You do. I saw the ledgers. I saw the clerk's report. You weren't involved." She paused, then added, "But you didn't stop it either." That struck true. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles still raw from fighting the fire. "I was afraid," he admitted, "of losing everything, of standing against the men who raised me, of becoming something they would never forgive." She studied him. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now I fear only what I've already lost." The words hung in the air, suspended like dust in a shaft of light. Aisling turned back to the window, the countryside blurred beneath the rain, trees bending under the weight of wind. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, but unwavering. "You hurt me," she said, "not just with your absence that day, but with your silence after. I waited. I searched every line of every letter you never sent. I questioned myself, my worth, my dignity." He listened, wordless, his throat dry. "I was not ashamed because I was poor," she continued. "I was ashamed because I believed in something that you abandoned the moment it became inconvenient." His breath caught. "I never stopped believing in you." She shook her head, not cruelly, but with the quiet finality of someone who had survived something unspeakable. "But you did stop fighting for me." The carriage rolled to a stop in front of her townhouse. She reached for the door handle, then paused. "I came today because your tenants deserve to know they were not alone, not because I forgive you." Rain spilled down in sheets as she stepped into the storm, her cloak pulled tight, her boots striking the wet stone with certainty. He watched her walk toward the house, her figure slowly swallowed by the curtain of rain. Inside the carriage, Declan remained still. The lamplight flickered, and his reflection in the glass looked back at him not as a marquis, not as a gentleman, but as a man who had failed to be brave when it mattered most. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the roofs and chimneys, the last smoke of the barn fire curled toward the heavens, carrying with it the remnants of old mistakes. Declan lowered his head. The reckoning had begun. The bells of the four courts rang solemnly that morning, as if Dublin herself had drawn breath in anticipation. Beneath a sky of winter ash, carriages filed into the courtyard like a slow procession of pride, vengeance, and curiosity. The cobblestones glistened from the early mist, and the air held the chill of something sacred about to be broken. Inside, the great hall had been arranged with brutal elegance. Wooden benches lined the walls, rows of grey-robed clerks fluttered about like ravens, and the magistrate's dais loomed at the far end, its height a reminder of justice's distance from mercy. Gas lamps hissed above, illuminating the polished floor where reputations would be shattered before noon. Aisling O'Devlin arrived on foot. She stepped from her carriage without fanfare, cloaked in charcoal wool that matched the solemn silk of her gown. Her bodice was modest, her skirt precise, her gloves black as ink. A single pearl rested at her throat, the only ornament in her ensemble, and her hair was swept into a style so restrained it seemed carved from discipline itself. Seamus Kearney followed 2 steps behind, holding the satchel of evidence against his chest like a reliquary. He wore his best coat, slightly too short in the sleeves, and his boots had been scrubbed until the leather cracked. His spectacles glinted with nerves, but his jaw was firm. When they entered the chamber, every head turned. The gentry sat to the right, ladies in feathered hats whispering behind lace fans, gentlemen sharpening their boredom with mockery. To the left sat the tenants, clerks, and shopkeepers, people whose futures depended on the outcome of a case that few had expected to reach open court. At the center of the room, Declan Rathmore stood alone. He wore a dark frock coat and a simple cravat, the regalia of his station stripped to its bones. His hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable. He did not speak. He only watched her as she entered, and the look in his eyes was not of regret nor plea, but of recognition. The magistrate called the hearing to order. The air settled like dust before a storm. Aisling rose. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but clear, cutting not through volume, but precision. "My name is Aisling O'Devlin," she said, "and I hold a controlling interest in the Glenfallen Canal Company. I come before you not as an heiress, nor as a woman wronged, but as a steward of the public trust. What I present today is not accusation, but evidence." She unfolded a single page and placed it on the table before her. "Over the past year, funds have been misallocated, tolls misrepresented, and repairs falsely claimed. These actions, hidden behind noble signatures, have cost tenant families their livelihoods and threatened to destabilize the entire canal economy." Seamus stepped forward, his hands trembling as he passed the magistrate a stack of ledgers. "These are the records," he said, "cross-verified with matched signatures and bank receipts. I have reviewed them myself." The magistrate nodded. "You are employed by the company." "I am," Seamus said, "but more importantly, I am a witness to truth." Gasps fluttered through the gentry. Aisling called her second witness, Bridget's mother. The woman entered timidly, hands folded in front of her patched apron, her face weathered but proud. She curtsied with awkward grace and looked only at Aisling as she spoke. "My son nearly died in the fire," she began, her voice husky. "But it was Lord Glenfallen who carried him through the smoke, who paid for the doctor, who brought food when we had none. He's changed. He listens now. And this woman, Miss O'Devlin, she came to us when the roof was still smoking and told us we would not be sold like cattle." The magistrate studied her. "Do you speak for others?" "I speak for the ones who can't leave their fields to come here," she said. "But we see what is done for us and what is done against us." When she stepped down, the silence rang louder than applause. Aisling stood again. "I call Lord Declan Rathmore to the stand." He approached slowly, his steps firm, but his breath measured. He did not look at his uncle, seated near the magistrate in a chair of carved mahogany that once symbolized absolute power. When Declan took the oath, the chamber stilled. He began not with defense, but with confession. "I abandoned my duty," he said, "not only to this company, but to the people it serves. I once believed that silence and tradition were forms of loyalty. I now understand that silence is complicity." A murmur swept through the crowd. "I do not stand here to rescue my name," he continued. "I stand to correct its path. The men who manipulated these records did so with my signature beneath theirs. That alone is guilt enough." Lord Rathmore shifted in his chair. Declan turned toward the bench. "I hereby relinquish my veto power over the Canal Company and transfer it to a cooperative fund, governed by a committee of tenant representatives and shareholders." I do this not as penance, but as necessity. No single name, noble or otherwise, should determine the price of water and wheat." A collective breath seemed to leave the room. The magistrate spoke after a long pause. "And Lord Rathmore?" Declan's gaze hardened. "He financed the sabotage. He bribed clerks. He ordered the publication of defamatory pamphlets to destroy Miss O'Devlin's credibility. All of it can be traced, by ledger, by signature, and by conscience." Lord Rathmore stood abruptly, his cane striking the floor. "This is slander," he growled. "It is truth," Declan said softly, "and I will testify to it under oath." The chamber erupted. The magistrate banged his gavel 3 times. Order was restored. When the ruling came, it was swift. The tribunal found Lord Rathmore guilty of financial misconduct and abuse of fiduciary duty. He was ordered to vacate all positions held within the Canal Company and forbidden from engaging in related enterprises for a period of 10 years. He left the courtroom without a word, his cane tapping once for each echo of his diminished empire. Aisling remained seated, her face pale but composed. Declan approached her after the ruling, his hat in hand. "They will never forgive me," he said, voice low. "You didn't do it for forgiveness," she replied. "You did it because it was right." Their eyes met. Neither moved. Later that evening, Declan returned to Glenfallen alone. The halls felt colder than usual, the silence deeper. In his study, a letter waited on the desk, sealed in dark red wax, the crest of his house pressed into its center. He opened it without ceremony. The handwriting was unmistakable. "You have destroyed what generations built. You chose sentiment over legacy. Do not look to me again." There was no signature. Declan read it once, then fed it into the fire. As the parchment curled and blackened, he watched the centuries-old legacy turn to smoke. And yet, in the ruin of it, something else began to take shape. Not legacy, but conscience. Not inheritance, but choice. And in that choice, perhaps, the first note of redemption. The scent of frost clung to the city like perfume worn too long. Winter had not yet arrived in full, but its breath kissed every window pane and made the cobblestones of Upper Mount Street ache beneath carriage wheels. Chimneys smoked like tired lungs, and the iron sky gave no hint of softness. Dublin, once vibrant with summer concerts and political gossip, had settled into a season of reflection. Within her townhouse, Aisling O'Devlin sat before the pianoforte but did not play. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, strong, elegant, shaped by years of discipline. But no sound came forth. The silence was not for lack of inspiration, nor injury, but something deeper. A silence made of memory, of hesitation, of wounds not yet closed. The tribunal had ruled in her favor. Lord Rathmore had been stripped of influence, exposed for his cruelty and deceit. Justice had been rendered, and yet she felt no triumph. She wore her victory like an ill-fitting gown, stiff at the shoulders, too heavy at the hem. Miss Nolan entered with a tray and paused at the doorway, observing the still figure of her mistress before the piano. Aisling's hair was pinned high, her charcoal gown simple but severe, as if she had dressed herself not for company, but for solitude. "You haven't touched breakfast," Miss Nolan said gently. "I'm not hungry. You haven't touched the piano either." Aisling's eyes remained on the ivory keys. "It no longer sounds the same." Miss Nolan set the tray down and crossed her arms. "Child, you've won the respect of a city. You've rebuilt what others tried to burn. And you've proven you're 10 times the leader any man on that tribunal will ever be. But you still wear grief like a veil." Aisling said nothing. Miss Nolan sighed. "You think you're being strong, keeping him at arm's length. But you're not punishing him anymore, Aisling. You're punishing yourself." Aisling turned slowly. He stood silent when it mattered. Then he stood beside me when it was nearly too late. "I don't know which man is real." "Then find out," Miss Nolan said, her voice softening. "But don't waste your life waiting for certainty. It never arrives when we expect it." That afternoon, Aisling walked to the schoolhouse at the edge of Merrion Square. It was modest, a single-room structure with chalkboards, a stove, and a worn rug donated by Lady Carrington's charity committee. The children were loud, their shoes unevenly laced, their hands forever ink-stained. But the laughter was genuine, and the light in their eyes untouched by politics or legacy. She visited often, though she rarely stayed long. She funded the lessons, reviewed the curriculum, ensured the bread delivered on time. But she never lingered. Until that day, because waiting just inside the door was a familiar face. Bridget. The little girl had grown stronger since the fire. Her cheeks now bore the bloom of health, her hair neatly braided with a red ribbon. She held a piece of paper folded in half, her fingers tight around the edges. "Miss O'Devlin," she said, voice bright with excitement, "I made this for you." Aisling knelt. "Did you now? Let me see." Bridget unfolded the drawing. Crayon lines, smudged in places, but clear enough. A tall woman seated at a piano, sunlight pouring in through a window. Her dress was grey, her hair red. Around her floated little musical notes like butterflies in the air. Aisling smiled despite herself. "It's lovely. He said your music made him want to be better," Bridget said suddenly. Aisling froze. "Who?" "Lord Glenfallen," the girl whispered, as if sharing a secret too fragile for the wind. "He comes to the village almost every day. He reads to us, builds things with the men. He tells the boys they're as clever as any scholar in Dublin. He says music is like kindness. It spreads when someone listens." Aisling folded the drawing slowly and held it against her chest. "Thank you, Bridget," she said, her voice caught somewhere between a breath and a prayer. That night she returned home just as the lamps were being lit. The golden glow of evening touched the stair banister like firelight, and the house felt warmer than it had in days. She sat by the hearth with her tea untouched, the drawing still in her lap, her mind adrift. She had not spoken to Declan since the tribunal. They had stood only feet apart in that crowded hall, and yet the distance between them had felt as vast as an ocean. Her silence had not been cruelty, it had been survival. But now that silence echoed back at her like the final chord of a sonata unresolved. Across the river, in Glenfallen, Declan worked until his hands blistered. He had taken off his cravat, rolled up his sleeves, and laboured beside tenant farmers who had once cursed his name. He hauled stones for the granary. He lifted beams until his shoulders ached. He used what he had not to command, but to serve. In the evenings, he sat in the schoolroom and read aloud from worn books, his voice steady, his eyes soft. And in the quiet moments before sleep, he thought of her, of the way she had looked in that courtroom, elegant, unbending, luminous, of the way she had refused his apologies, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. And he understood. Some wounds did not close with words. They required time and presence and patience. Still, he waited. The following week, a parcel arrived at Aisling's doorstep. No note, no signature. Inside, a small wooden box, hand-carved, its lid shaped like a grand piano. Inside it, a music box mechanism, delicate, humble, and when wound, it played the first few bars of her composition unspoken. But the melody had changed, just slightly. The notes still mourned, but they lifted too, as if the ending had been rewritten by hands that had learned to hope again. Aisling closed the lid gently. She held it to her chest, and for the first time in many weeks she wept, not from pain, but from the terrifying possibility that something broken could still be made new. Not yet, but perhaps soon. Dublin, early autumn of 1871. The city, awash in a warm dusk light, shimmered as if touched by a painter's careful brush. Gas lamps flickered to life one by one, their soft halos catching the fine mist in the air. The River Liffey moved like a ribbon of burnished silver beneath the Halfpenny Bridge, and just beyond Merrion Square, the great hall of the Royal Academy opened its carved wooden doors to a crowd dressed in their finest. Tonight was no ordinary concert. It was a benefit organized for widowed mothers, many left destitute by the rail collapse in Cork and the cholera outbreak that had followed. Aisling O'Devlin, now a name whispered with reverence in the parlours of both the gentry and the working class, had pledged all proceeds from the evening to support their care. But the concert had come to mean something else as well, a quiet unveiling, not only of music but of wounds and healing long deferred. Inside the gilded concert hall, murmurs of anticipation floated above the rustle of taffeta and the subtle polish of boots on parquet floors. The chandeliers above sparkled with such intensity they seemed to hold stars captive. The audience, which included merchants, clergy, parliamentarians and housemaids alike, had not come merely for entertainment. They had come for Aisling. When she appeared on stage, the hall fell into breathless stillness. She wore a gown of dark indigo satin, fitted at the bodice with delicate embroidery that shimmered like frost traced across glass. Her auburn hair was swept into a coiled chignon, held by silver combs that caught the candlelight with every movement. She bowed with a grace honed not in ballrooms, but in the quiet rigor of self-respect reclaimed. Behind her waited the orchestra, a modest ensemble of 11 musicians, their instruments gleaming. At the center of the stage stood a grand piano. Aisling crossed to it without haste, the train of her gown whispering over the floor, and sat. Her fingers hovered above the keys for one suspended moment. Then, with no announcement, she began. The first notes of the Glenfallen Waltz rose like fog over a field at dawn, hushed, uncertain, and exquisitely fragile. A simple melody, barely a murmur, blooming slowly into a theme laced with longing. It did not speak of bitterness. It spoke of seasons turning, of hands once empty finding purpose again. The middle movement swelled with unexpected warmth, not triumph, but quiet resilience. And then, in the final measures, a high, tender refrain returned, echoing the opening, altered now, as if the land itself had exhaled. By the time her hands lifted from the last chord, more than a few handkerchiefs had been raised discreetly. Even Lady Carrington, known more for her scrutiny than her sentiment, dabbed at the corners of her eyes. But Aisling did not see them. Her gaze had drifted toward the edge of the gallery, where a figure stood just beyond the reach of the footlights. Tall, still, shadowed, in his arms he cradled something wrapped in burlap and twine. Declan. He did not applaud. He simply watched. And she knew in that silent look that he had heard every unsaid word woven into the music. When the concert ended, Aisling slipped away from the accolades. She descended the rear stairs of the academy into the cool evening, where the scent of damp leaves mingled with coal smoke. Her hands still trembled, not from nerves, but from release. She had not expected to find him waiting by the carriage portico. He had removed his gloves. His coat, worn and rain-darkened at the hem, bore the subtle scent of earth and wood smoke. In his hands he held a small sapling, a young apple tree no taller than her waist, its roots bundled carefully in damp cloth and tied with a blue ribbon. "I didn't know what flowers to bring," he said. His voice was low, rough as if unused for days, but gentle. She blinked, startled by the unlikeliness of the gesture. "A tree," she murmured, her tone unreadable. "Not for now, for later." He looked down at the bundle, as if unsure whether to hold it out. "It will take time, but I'll tend it every day, even if the fruit takes years." The metaphor was unmistakable, and yet he did not press it. There were no declarations, no apologies rehearsed for effect. Just the offering, quiet and unadorned. She looked at his hands, calloused, cracked at the knuckles. Once so pristine with noble idleness, now rough from work, she had only recently begun to believe he truly embraced. And then at his face, older than it had seemed when she first loved him, weathered now, humbled, honest. She reached out, not for the tree, but for him. Her hand slipped into his, and they stood that way beneath the gas lamp, two figures in the golden hush of evening, surrounded by the distant echo of city bells and the soft murmur of passing wheels. "I will too," she said at last. "Tend it." He nodded. Still no kiss, no rush. Instead, he placed the bundle gently at her feet. And then, just as gently, he lifted her free hand and pressed it to his heart. It was racing. Aisling felt a tremor pass between them, not heat, but stillness, as if the world had paused to make space for this exact moment. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "Not yet." "You're not," she agreed softly, "and that's why I can begin to give it." From inside the hall, the echoes of a cello drifted faintly down the corridor. Someone had begun tuning again, unaware that the most powerful music of the evening was no longer on stage. They did not speak further. They didn't need to. When at last she turned to go, she did not let go of his hand. They walked side by side beneath the arc of gaslight and bare branches, the sapling behind them waiting as the city around them exhaled. The first frost of autumn had barely kissed the edges of the Glenfallen fields, yet already the earth whispered of renewal. The canal waters flowed steady and clear, their banks lined with reeds heavy from summer's end. Merchants' barges passed with greater frequency, and the once abandoned grain depot now stood repaired, its shutters painted a hopeful blue. Children ran along the towpath after lessons, their laughter echoing where only silence had reigned a year before. It was not a dramatic transformation, but it was lasting, and it bore the unmistakable marks of Aisling O'Devlin. The Glenfallen Canal Company, once a symbol of exploitation, had become something altogether different under her guidance. Alongside a growing tenants' cooperative, Aisling's trust fund helped administer fair tolls, maintain the canal, and redistribute profits toward education, housing, and public works. Where Lord Rathmore once saw only dominion, she saw dignity restored. Declan Rathmore, now rarely referred to by his title, had relinquished much: his veto power, his father's legacy, the illusion of entitlement. But he had gained something far greater: purpose. He walked the canal banks each morning with a ledger tucked under one arm and a boy trailing behind him, asking questions about grain tariffs or measuring water depth with a stick. Some evenings he joined Seamus Kearney in the new office to revise cooperative voting rights, or carried sacks of lime to reinforce the schoolhouse foundation before the heavy winter rains. He no longer wore polished boots or silk-lined coats, but work shirts with rolled sleeves and calluses that had earned their place. And though he and Aisling often crossed paths at council meetings or tenant gatherings, no one, not even Miss Nolan, dared assume anything more. Until one particular morning in late October, when the air in Dublin felt heavier with mist than usual, and the Halfpenny Bridge appeared like a sketch in watercolour, barely real in the fog. Aisling had risen before the bells. She wore a high-necked wool walking gown in soft plum, her cloak pinned with the silver brooch Seamus had once given her when he'd said, "For strength, not decoration." Her hair was braided and tucked beneath a dark bonnet, though a few strands refused containment. She had not expected to find Declan waiting. He stood at the centre of the bridge, framed by iron arches, holding nothing, asking nothing, only looking toward her with a stillness that startled her. The fog softened the space between them, but did not hide the quiet smile that crept over his face as she approached. "I thought I might find you here," she said, her breath visible in the morning air. "I hoped you would," he replied. They stood for a moment in silence, listening to the slow ripple of the river below, to the faint bells of St. Stephen's, to the city as it began to stir. "I've watched you," he said finally, "build something from what others tried to burn. You gave Glenfallen a future I never imagined possible. You gave me one." Aisling looked down at the cobblestones between them. "It wasn't charity, it was justice and necessity." He nodded. "But it was also grace." Then, with a steady breath, he stepped closer. "I'm not asking you to save me, Aisling," he said, "not to make me better, or to undo what's been done. I'm asking if you'll walk beside me, as a partner, in the field, in the meeting hall, in the kitchen, and wherever the road takes us next. Her chest rose and fell. And if I say yes, she asked softly, then I'll plant that apple tree near the schoolhouse and we'll watch it grow, with no promises of perfection, only of constancy. She did not answer immediately. She reached instead for his hand. It was warm despite the cold, rough despite the tenderness of the moment. Aisling looked up at him, her eyes no longer guarded. "This time," she said, her voice a whisper layered with meaning, "I'll bring the music." He smiled, not with triumph, but with something deeper, humility, relief, and quiet awe. Their wedding took place 2 weeks later, far from the marble chapels and linen-covered parlours of high society. It was held in the orchard just beyond the tenant cottages, where the first apples had begun to ripen late in the season. There were no gilded invitations, no orchestras or grand gowns, only lanterns strung between trees, baskets of bread and cider, and the hum of anticipation among people who had once known only toil. Bridget, wearing a wreath of wildflowers and a dress sewn by Miss Nolan's clever hands, sat at the piano borrowed from the schoolhouse. Her fingers stumbled gently through a beginner's waltz, the same tune Aisling had once composed by lamplight in sorrow. Now, in the golden hour of her joy, it sounded like sunlight filtered through leaves. Seamus gave a toast that made half the guests cry and the other half cheer. Aisling wore ivory linen with lace at the cuffs, her hair unadorned except for the curl that brushed her cheek. She did not walk down an aisle. She walked across grass, through neighbours who parted willingly, toward a man who waited not with promises of grandeur, but with an open hand and eyes full of devotion. They were married beneath the branches of the tallest tree in the orchard, its bark carved long ago with initials no one could read anymore. And as they turned to face their guests, laughter erupted like birdsong. No official bells rang that day, but the orchard felt fuller, the sky wider, the path ahead lit by more than lanterns. Later that evening, as the sun slipped behind the rooftops of Dublin, Aisling stood alone at the edge of the orchard, watching children chase fireflies while elders swayed to the rhythm of fiddle and flute. Declan joined her, silent. "They're dancing," she said, her voice hushed with wonder. "Because of you," he replied. "No," she said, leaning her head gently against his shoulder, "because of us." And so, not in the ballroom that had once cast her out, not beneath chandeliers or judgmental gazes, but in the open air among those she had chosen to serve and love, Aisling became not only a wife, but a builder of futures. She had once been left at the altar for being poor. Now, beneath stars and apple blossoms, she was rich in everything that mattered. And Dublin, a city that had once turned its back, now called her, quietly, reverently, its heroine. The orchard behind the Glen Fallon School bore fruit now with such abundance that children complained of sore arms from the picking. The apple tree Declan planted with Aisling stood tall at the edge of the canal, its branches arching like a crown over the schoolyard fence. Its blossoms had come and gone in 8 cycles, and in that time, so too had lives changed, deepened, and quietly turned toward grace. Aisling stood beneath that tree now, her auburn hair streaked with threads of silver. The wind played at the hem of her wool skirt, and she held a folded shawl in her arms, just in case her daughter grew cold before the sun dipped fully behind the hills. The girl, Maeve, 7 years old, had her mother's sharp eyes and her father's easy smile. She was running ahead, chasing Bridget's younger brother, laughing with a sound that was all light and no shadow. The Glenfallen Cooperative had grown into a model for reform throughout Ireland. With Aisling's oversight and Seamus Kearney's steadfast guidance as fund administrator, the canal no longer served only the wealthy landowners. It had become a vein of opportunity for farmers, for millers, for school teachers with ideas and poets with none. The parish school, once a humble project, now educated both boys and girls, and had sent its first student to Trinity College the year before. Bridget, now nearly 16, taught piano twice a week to neighborhood children and had begun composing pieces of her own. She often played for Maeve, whose tiny hands still struggled with the keys, but whose sense of rhythm made her father beam with pride. Declan, ever changed, ever steady, spent most of his days as a steward of the land and a listener to the people. His boots were worn and his fingers stiff with the years, but his presence carried more weight than any marquis could command. He rarely spoke of his title. Most forgot he even had one. At council meetings he deferred. At home he listened. And in the orchard with Aisling, he smiled like a man who had learned what to cherish and what to release. Lord Rathmore had died 6 years earlier in exile, in a London boarding house with drawn curtains and unpaid debts. His legacy faded with him, unremembered by most, unwelcome to others. The manor he once ruled had been sold, its portraits auctioned off, its halls left hollow. A family of tenant farmers now lived on the land, planting barley where once there had been disdain. Seamus, ever loyal, never married, though the postmistress swore he kept a letter in his vest with Aisling's name on it, never sent, never burned. He found fulfillment in work, in watching Maeve grow, and in quiet evenings by the hearth, where he played fiddle tunes that carried notes of both joy and longing. Miss Nolan remained Aisling's truest confidant. Though her bones had grown brittle, her voice had not. She ran the parish girls' reading circle with the same iron will and cinnamon biscuits she had offered to heartbroken pupils decades before. And she alone knew how often Aisling still woke in the night to write music by candlelight, her heart filled with a quiet ache she never named. That autumn, Dublin had changed. Street lamps now lined the lanes once cloaked in soot. There were more schools, fewer workhouses, and whispers of suffrage passed between women over market baskets and laundry lines. It was still a city of edges and elegance, but it had softened ever so slightly toward mercy. And yet, amidst all the progress, all the growth, it was still the orchard that held Aisling's heart most tightly. It was there, on the 8th anniversary of their wedding, that Declan found her. She stood with the shawl still in her arms, watching the sun slide behind the apple tree, its leaves gold and rust-coloured, the air fragrant with ripened fruit. He said nothing, only stepped beside her, as he always did. Maeve had run off to join Bridget at the piano now set in the schoolyard for a harvest recital. The girls were tuning strings, laughing over missed notes and squeaky keys. Music drifted, tentative and true, across the orchard. 8 years, Declan murmured. Still feels like we're only just beginning. Aisling smiled, eyes warm but distant. That's the secret, I think. The best songs are never quite finished. He reached for her hand, calloused and familiar. She laced her fingers through his. Do you miss the music hall? He asked. I bring it with me, she said. Every time Maeve sings, every time Bridget plays, every time someone dares to dream out loud. The lanterns above began to flicker to life, lit one by the children. A ring of soft orange light encircled the orchard once more, as it had on the night she became his wife. Only now it was not a circle of guests. It was a circle of legacy. Aisling looked out at the family's gathering, the harvest laid out on linen cloths, the laughter rising again from simple joys. She pressed her hand gently to her heart. You once told me it would take time, she said, to heal, to trust, to grow. And you said you would tend it too, he replied. They turned to each other, eyes meeting like old verses remembered in silence. I did, she whispered. I know, he said. No kiss. Just a soft touch to her cheek, a lingering glance, a quiet sigh that carried all the years between them. And, as the Glenfallen waltz began again, played with more assurance now by Bridget's confident fingers, Aisling and Declan joined hands and walked into the circle of lanterns, not to begin and not to end, but to continue, as love does when it is planted deeply and tended every day. Some stories don't end with a kiss beneath the stars. They end with hands held through every season, with roots that grow deeper each year, and with hearts that choose, again and again, to heal, to hope, and to love. Aisling and Declan's journey wasn't one of perfect timing or flawless choices. It was a path carved by courage, forgiveness, and a belief that even the deepest wounds can bloom into something lasting. Her music, once silenced by heartbreak, became the anthem of a new future, not just for herself, but for an entire community. And his redemption was not granted by grand gestures, but earned through quiet, patient acts of devotion. This tale reminds us that true strength lies in rising after ruin, and that the heart, when nurtured, can grow orchards where there was once only stone. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect or brought tears to your eyes, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what part moved you most, and if you made it all the way to the end, write the word orchard, so we know you're part of this circle of hearts that believe in love's quiet power. If you'd like to support the team that brings these timeless romances to life, you can do so by sending a super thanks here on YouTube. Any amount you choose from the heart makes a world of difference and helps us keep creating stories like this one. And if you're not able to support financially, please consider sharing this video with a friend or family member who loves emotional period love stories. Your recommendation is one of the kindest gifts you can give us. More unforgettable tales of love, redemption, and second chances await you. Just click the story cards on the screen to continue the journey. Thank you for being here. Your presence means more than you know.